Hi everyone, my name is Cyril Filias and I'm the lead program learning and development at SAREC. And on behalf of the entire team, welcome back to our webinar series called Decent Work on a Changing Planet, Practical Strategy for Developing a More Equitable World for Our Clients, and presented by Traveling and Brian Mallet. Today, Traveling Brian will continue the conversation with a special focus on discussing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and exploring which career theory could be applied to create positive impact for your clients. But before starting this second session, I want to pay respect to the original people of the territory upon which I physically sit and acknowledge that on the day of this video recording, I'm coming to you from Toronto, and that for dozens of years, this land has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga Anishinaabe of New Credit. And in our effort to support reconciliation through education and shared learning, we would like to share an article written by Marisa Barata, one of our CareerWise contributors, who provided resources to learn more about decolonizing job search and hiring. We will post the link to the link to the article in the chat. And as always, I will encourage anyone who wishes to share resources toward reconciliation to do that as well in the chat. Now, as today marks the final webinar of the series, we will be sharing a short survey at the end of the session where we will invite you to provide feedback on this webinar series and share your future learning need with us. So thank you in advance for your feedback. Now, just a quick reminder that as last week, this webinar is presented to you on a similar format with the presentation being pre-recorded, but you still have the possibility to post your question and comment in the chat. Our two presenters will be with us and answer your question during the Q&A session. Finally, note that we'll be sharing the copy of the presentation along with resources in the next 24 hours. With all that, we will now launch the second session of our series.
Welcome back, everyone. Again, my name is Trevor Lehman. So glad you're here.
I'm Brian Malott. I'm glad to continue on this journey with you.
Perfect. So this is part 2 of our webinar series. Hope if you haven't yet, I highly recommend you go back and watch part 1. Again, this is all sponsored by CIRIC. We really appreciate their support and giving us this platform. And we're so excited to kind of continue this conversation with you today.
And don't worry if you haven't watched the last video. We're going to do a quick recap episode, basically what you missed in the previous episode.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, this is Decent Work on a Changing Planet, and today we're going to be talking a lot about practical strategies for a more equitable world for our clients. With that said, again, we're going to be doing a bit of a review from part 1, just a brief one of the highlights, though I do recommend you go read that or watch the original recording in full if you haven't. Then we're going to be talking about truth and reconciliation and its application to decent work and career work. We're going to be talking a bit about career theories, and then we're going to have a conversation about why the ladder, which is sort of a bit of a crossover from our discussion in the first part. And then we'll be doing question and answer. So with that said, quick recap from the first session. We talked a lot about how the climate crisis is really endangering workers, and that we talk about a just transition being something that ensures that in the coming decades of change, that we make sure no one falls through the cracks. That when they talk about new jobs being created within the new world we're going to be living in, that these jobs are good jobs and decent jobs that ensure people are treated with dignity. We talked a bit about the definition of a just transition, sort of encompassing that. And we talked a little bit about it being a way to be as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned. And that specifically in creating a just transition, that this is not something that we necessarily advise clients in individual ways, but that there's also a collective action aspect. And this can look like organized labor. This can look like unionization. This can look like worker collectives, but this can also just be mass movements, grassroots movements. This, again, this collective action term can be applied in a lot of ways. In the work context, we often looked at decent work, and we looked to the International Labor Organization as ensuring that clients have opportunities for work that is productive and delivers fair income. Again, finding security, having freedom of expression, freedom to be their own identity with safety from discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism, and again, prospects for social integration and personal growth. Then we talked about applying it. We talked about 5 principles for facilitating decent work and collective action. Again, we talked about raising consciousness with the client, talking about decent work, talking about how it applies to their lives. We talked about normalizing conflict. So the idea that you could be collaborative with people while still disagreeing with them, while taking stances, and how you could hold both these things to be in tension with each other. Of course, we talk about recognizing our own privilege, intersectionality, and how we are limited by our own worldviews and how we don't want to, and we'll be talking a bit about this more today, but about not recreating the colonial effects in our counseling and career work with clients. We talked about educating on labor rights, making sure clients know what they're legally entitled to, and then how to act on that knowledge in a way that empowers them, that makes people feel their own knowledge and collaborate with others in order to create a better world. Brian, did you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, we talked about just kind of looking at decent work and kind of looking at that holistic approach. So kind of looking at work that kind of involves your heart, your mind, your body, your spirit, and kind of framing that in a way that just questions to ask and things to look at when exploring decent work.
So we're going to now start talking about truth and reconciliation. I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Now we're just going to look at how do we help people find decent work while looking at reconciliation, right? We're going to look at simple actions to work towards true reconciliation, removing it from being too hard to start, right? A lot of the times it looks overwhelming and whatnot, and we're going to try and break it down to a couple simple steps to make it easier to progress. And we're also going to walk through a couple of the actions of the calls to action that kind of help you frame it into a career development point of view. So on the excellent. So when we look at kind of truth and reconciliation, there's kind of 4 lenses to look at, right? We want to learn about the history. We want to understand the history as well. We want to act, so take some action in that, and then reflect on what we're learning. I've kind of built on kind of stuff from Jody Wilson-Raybon. It was in her book, and my director Guy Williams kind of add the reflection parts into this. So again, the 4 simple actions when you're breaking it down are going to be to learn, to understand, to act, and reflect. And so throughout this, we're going to kind of walk you through some steps of learning about some of the calls to action, help you understand it. We're going to brainstorm some ideas on how to act on that, and then we'll do some reflecting after that.
Absolutely.
So looking at the calls to action, one of the things that came out a lot was kind of talking about skill-based training for various sectors to help them understand the historical implications and the current realities of colonization on the First Nation, Métis, Inuit people of Canada. Right. So we highlight 3 calls to action right here. Calls to action 24, 27, 57. And one of the things that all 3 of them have is this will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. And I think those things also lean into the decent work conversation we've been having about what does decent work look like. And I think if you can get some of the human rights, the anti-racism into that will help create decent work. So we'll also send out the slides so you can read the calls to action in full. So when we were kind of thinking about looking at it from a career development training kind of perspective, right, how does that help with Indigenous history, legacy, teachings, and current practices? And how do we kind of bring that to the forefront, right? So one of the things that we had seen in many of the calls to action, so I think there's about 6 or 9 calls to action that talked about it, was having required or provided education on Indigenous people and also including the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and talking about treaties and Aboriginal rights, but also the Indigenous teachings and practices that are both current and historical, right? How do you bring those into an understanding of what it means to work in a decent work setting, right?
Mhm.
So again, we're looking at that. We want you to learn some stuff. We want you to understand, take some actions, and then reflect on what you're doing, and then do it again. So now, one thing we want to kind of chat with Trevor about this and have kind of more of an open conversation, not just a presentation, but kind of when we were looking at the calls to action where they were asking for additional training to be supported, they highlighted these 9 areas in the actions, right? So they talked about education, medical, law, public servants, social sciences and humanity research council, council for the arts, corporate sector, sports hall of fame, hall of fames and organizations, and journalism, right? And as we were exploring that, I think that covers pretty much most careers that we would interact with in a day-to-day setting in a career field. So I guess part of what I'm wondering, just to start the conversation off, Trevor, is like, how might we kind of support clients that we're working with that are going into these fields to be more curious about kind of Indigenous history or the legacy, or explore teachings?
This is and again, this is going to be a little bit more of an open conversation. And um, I think that one of the things you had mentioned before was sort of certainly the Indigenous education component being built into a lot of curriculum. And we're certainly seeing that in some of the schools now, and faculty starting to adopt that as sort of a mandatory component. And and some schools even beginning to adopt that kind of across the board, no matter what you're studying. Would certainly be one. Do you find that to be, how would you find that to be, Brian?
I think it's, yeah, education, you've got to easily kind of add into learning outcomes and some course content that can kind of be there. And I'm starting to see it as well in some of the corporate training elements I see, like in different employers I've supported and worked with, that they're kind of bringing in that awareness or asking those questions, right? And I think to be to participate in that kind of labor market and stuff, I think supporting our clients and being able to ask good questions and kind of find out about kind of the current realities of Indigenous people, and also how that is impacted from historical context. So
one suggestion had been made to me a while ago, and I want to maybe get your thoughts on it, would be I've talked to people about kind of who've suggested kind of ensuring a bit of a restructuring of power dynamics around vice presidents, and that in some corporate sectors as well as public education, we have sometimes an vice president Indigenous or vice president equity sort of group, but that if we wanted to really focus on giving them greater power to within these organizations to make them more equitable, making the other vice presidents report to them would be an option that would then give them greater control, as opposed to them sort of being in a separate silo. Whereas it would be a bit of a different dynamic if the VP of finance and the VP of research and all that had to go through them to get their approval.
yeah, I think I like that setting. It just kind of makes it more of a collaborative relationship, right? That it's not just a siloed, EDI or Indigenous portion of the kind of company, but kind of having collaborative, that your actions at the company are working through a lens of collaboration that way. So yeah, I think that's an interesting concept. And I think, and it doesn't have to just be, it was always supposed to be a kind of that going together, like both systems kind of living separately and apart, but not interfering with each other, like the Indigenous sector and the new approaches brought over, right? So I think finding ways to kind of find those collaborations, that'd be a great one. I think it'd be fun to have see that kind of work through and see how does that play, right? I think it just brings the conversation as kind of being equal and having that. So
Mhm. I'm curious in your own work, because I know you work and oversee a lot of students as well in your education initiatives. How have you found it to sort of play out? Have you found there have been any initiatives within your own space and your work history that you found to be effective or helpful?
I think I've noticed the conversation over the last couple of years has kind of shift into instead of being kind of almost like a requirement, like to hate to use the term like a checkbox that you have to meet this equity hiring. It's more shifted to a conversation with employers about how to support Indigenous hires once they are hired, right? And how do you create a workplace that's more equitable, right? So I think it's beginning to shift a lot in the last couple of years of having those conversations of like, what does that look like? And I think one thing I try to do is just kind of facilitate collaboration between different employers and let them be able to share best practices and like, kind of give insight into it where I can, but not a expert by any means. But I think just helping create that space, and that I guess kind of it works best to kind of keep in that. One of the knowledge keepers we work with, Liz Aquinenzi, she always talks about when we're helping students that they want to be seen, heard, and understood, right? That students want to be seen for who they are. They want to be heard for what their story is, but also where they currently are, where they're hoping to go. And they just how to understand them too, right? So what does understanding mean? So I think when I work with employers, I encourage them that same model of like, Indigenous people just want to be seen, heard, and understood, right? And how does that play out in your organization? Seen as more than just an equity hire, but seen as adding a value and a different perspective and opinion into conversation, right? So and I think that's where kind of learn, understand, act, and reflect lean into it too, is that I think sometimes we overcomplicate situations that, if we just work it down to the base steps, it makes it easier to move forward on big issues. Like I know throughout this conversation, these webinars, we've been talking about, decent work, changing environment. We've talked about lots of things. And I think to be honest, you can be overwhelmed by some of these, thinking like, how can I change this, right? And I think that keeping it simple, like I appreciate you coming to this webinar, right? You're taking the chance to learn and understand kind of about decent work and truth and reconciliation and environment and unionization and how does that work. So I think
I think there's a lot there too to kind of to pull up to sort of examine. But one thing I really heard there that also stood out to me was the idea that the hires and the people that are being brought into organizations are not seen as a check mark, but they're seen as like it's sort of a true collaboration, right? That they're collaborators, they're not check marks, and that if we want people to be treated with dignity, they have to be seen and truly seen, and not just sort of on an Excel spread, and not seen just as sort of a thing that must be done, but rather something that will genuinely improve the organization.
Yeah, I think that's really at the heart of it, right? If you truly feel valued in the workplace that you're working in, right? That goes a lot towards that decent work, right? That feeling of, I know we highlighted those 5 principles of for management, right? And we talked about that just autonomy and that also ability to kind of feel valued. Yeah. And I think that's where the calls to action kind of are, just kind of laying out almost a framework of things that would support and help make an environment that Indigenous employees would feel welcomed in. Yeah, and a lot of it. So this was call to action number 92, talking about business and reconciliation. So it kind of lays out a lot of the ask for corporate Canada, kind of creating frameworks and operating procedures. But the one that I always kind of lean on is that part 2 of it, that ensuring that Aboriginal or Indigenous people have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities. Right? and they can gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development, right? I think it's not enough just to hire. You have to hire and grow and sustain employees, right? And also provide those training opportunities, right? They also talk about highlighting education to management about the history of Indigenous people and kind of what does that look like. So I know in the first example, we kind of laid out 3 different calls to action, kind of walk through a little more detailed, kind of helping you kind of walk through learning and understanding. And so this one, I just want to kind of talk a little bit about, what's some things that come up to you and me, Trevor, is this, and like, how can we support our clients in the
the spaces they find themselves in.
Yeah.
I think this also really dovetails nicely with what you said before, Brian, as far as education that around Indigenous peoples for managers, and so that we both operate at the level of people when they're receiving training and through formal education, but also through the informal education of the work environment, right? That the managers are being provided with that same training, that the staff are being provided with that same training, and that it kind of goes kind of bottom up and top down, that education comes from.
I think, yeah, that's a great sight that you're both learning from the bottom up and the top down. And one thing that stands out to me in that is just the equitable access to jobs, training, and education, right? That what does that look like? And equitable is different than equal, right? Like, it's not just offering both employees, training one, but how do you balance it out? Maybe there's additional skills or trainings that need to be added to help make that more of an equitable scenario or create more opportunities, right? And I think it's also a lot of the conversations I have is breaking down understanding what jobs are, that it's not just the job offer, it's the placement opportunity, or it's the co-op, or it's the mentorship, or it's there's a lot of elements that us as career developers know how to help people kind of grow in their career and develop those skills. And I think it's not, sometimes we get lost on it's just the job posting that's posted towards, say, an Indigenous hire, but it's how do you create those career development opportunities that help Indigenous people kind of thrive in the work environment, right? So get the opportunities to get the cool internship, or get the mentoring opportunity that they wouldn't normally get, or creating working groups that you can kind of share and collaborate with things, or the cool projects too, right? So
yeah, and I know in your work, I think you do a lot of that too, that you very much, in the conversations I've had with you before, Brian, I very much come to appreciate the sort of the power that you hold as a co-op provider, as a internship sort of coordinator, to ensure that you're demanding that that these opportunities be provided, and that the students feel supported. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that'd be definitely fair to say. Like, I think I really enjoy helping. I've had a number of co-op students over the last kind of couple of years. You've probably hired 6 to 10 a summer, and really trying to find opportunities to help them move towards their career goals. So I've got a current placement student who really wants some additional training to help with one of their long-term career goals. They want to kind of get this specialized training. So when I was working with them to kind of come up with their placement learning outcomes for this term, I just put their placement outcome was to attain this training, right? So it's on the formalized documentation that we're going to marking and grading on, and also as our learning plan, like, so it's a set thing to attain this training, right? Which I think came from a conversation with that individual, find out kind of what their career goals were, and then helping to facilitate that. And by me formalizing and putting it on like a training agreement, it's just something that we have to do now. It's not we'd like to, we would have got to it if we could have. Like, no, this is it's part of the requirement now, so we have to. And it's a little bit pricey of a training, but I think it'll help them in their career. So I think it's that advocacy work too, of making sure that it would have been easy just to say, yeah, I'll look at some, career development opportunities, but to actually formalize and help make a plan, and then use the tools and structure that we have to help kind of facilitate that career development for that student. And I look at that as that, even though it's one student kind of case study, it kind of, how do you apply that to others, right? How do you use the tools and abilities of, maybe it's policy, maybe it's, setting learning outcomes, maybe it's performance goals, maybe it's, how do you kind of create and shift that in?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, so very much that advocacy piece. And I imagine that's tremendously powerful for the clients themselves when they see, like, sure, I want this, this expensive training would be great. And then being like, absolutely, let's figure out a way to get that money and make that happen.
Yeah. And I think it shows that I'm actually like, that you're trying to strive to hear what they need, what they want, what they're, and maybe it's the big thing that they're too scared to ask for, because like nobody's ever gonna say yes to that. Well, be the person who says yes, I guess, right?
Yeah, and kind of putting ourselves and using the power we have to not to push people through a funnel, but to emphasize, like, you tell us what you need, and then we'll use our what strength we have to make sure you get as much of this as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think and I think it's kind of advocating for people and kind of helping them move forward, but also it's, helping them figure out how to manage their career, and like encouraging them it's okay to dream too. And I think, just as we've been talking about that, right, the one thing I kind of hope that people take away from, right, if I know some of the stuff we're talking about in these webinars can be big, and I know we've struggled to, how do we take the 40 hours of conversation we've had down to 40 minutes of doing this. But I think the simple actions of, like, learn stuff, understand kind of more deeper, take action, whatever that looks like. Could be small, could be big, but then reflect on what you've been kind of learning and understanding in action, and kind of what can you learn more. So
absolutely. I love the simplification too, that sometimes, though these are very complicated topics, that there is sometimes a point where we do need to think about it, and then sort of act on it, and then reflect in that cycle, which is something that parallels a lot of what we talk to our clients about in career development too, right? That, you got to do something, reflect on it, see how it goes, reflect on it, then learn new and research new stuff, and then do it again. That it's a sort of a continuous cycle as opposed to just a destination that you will arrive at. At this point, we're going to transition a little bit to talk. Speaking of learning, understanding, acting, and reflecting, we wanted to try to bridge the gap a little bit between this and some of the career theories. So there are many, many career theories out there, but we thought we'd pick 3 and talk a little bit about some examples of how they can apply to the decent workspace. Again, with this recent chat, we've been talking a lot about how we as career professionals can support people, but also that we don't want to forget that it's important to kind of emphasize to clients how they can get together with their colleagues or with their communities and advocate for creating change that not only enhances their own agency, but their own sense of power within society. So hope action theory, which for the summary here, I'm actually pulling from Career Theories and Models at Work, my favorite books. And it's but hope action theory essentially is the idea that talks a lot about adaptability, and it talks about hope. So hope is, again, envisioning that meaningful goal and believing that positive outcomes are likely to occur should specific actions be taken. And that you need to hope. You have to believe that the future could be better than the present, or could be as good. If you don't believe that the future can be good, then everything else kind of falls apart. And I think that to your point was sort of, as Brian was mentioning, that necessity of being willing to dream. And that this can be very empowering. I talk a lot about that in some of my other presentations around cultivating hope specifically, and some specific strategies around that. So we won't go into as much depth there, but I really wanted to talk about adaptability and its focus and its connection to collective action, which is being able to change, essentially, and being open to new information that may lead to changing your goals or staying the course, so to speak. Often clients can get stuck, and particularly I've observed with clients who maybe have a history of being oppressed, that they do feel kind of stuck and they think that the past will be the same as the future. So hope action theory, however, talks a lot about how to achieve career adaptability and talks a lot about reflecting on that new information. And that as career professionals, we can help clients from a point of consciousness raising to self-reflect on new information about oneself and how situations are changing, and transform that new knowledge and awareness into strategic behavior, leading to satisfying career development. In the States, we've seen a bit of that with the unionization in the Starbucks movements. There is a good example of one where they saw sort of their work environment changing and then decided, reflected on their individually. Many of these people reflected and thought, what do we need to do to change this? And they thought, well, maybe in that case, the nature of their relationship with their employer had gotten to the point where they thought we need to unionize. And that was sort of an application of hope action theory, not just applying to the individual, but saying, how do I look around? Can I look to my colleagues to support me in creating a career change? Planned happenstance would be a second one. So again, quick summary, but planned happenstance is always about kind of creating your own luck and how putting yourself out there can create unexpected opportunities. The 5 aspects for that are, again, curiosity, again, being open to new experiences, open to new things, flexibility, persistence. And this is an optimism and risk-taking. I see this a lot with the organizers that I work with, the environmentalists, organized labor, where, your odds of success aren't always that great. The number, and that despite that, though, can you also acknowledge that sometimes the uncertainty could lead to beneficial outcomes that we maybe haven't thought of. I've seen people who got involved in organizing and collective action and ended up getting job offers out of that, just because often they're looking for that lived experience. Likewise, one of my favorite quotes I use all the time is from Han Solo in Star Wars, the never tell me the odds. That, of course, you want to be aware of, what risks can come there, but you want to know that sometimes, even though the odds aren't always super high that they're going to work out, that there is still a chance. And that kind of ties in with hope action theory as well, that you want to be hopeful about the future, even if we know the odds aren't always as good as we'd like them to be. And lastly, I wanted to talk about advocating workers within environment. This is Brian Hutchinson's research, particularly in its application to sort of what we've been talking about. I do include a link at the bottom to the article. I recommend everyone read it. It really talks a lot about making sure that we do not be very sensitive to and critical that we don't recreate colonization in our practices, in our career practices, that we don't dehumanize people, and that we work, in fact, in a very realistic way of the needs of the individual, but that we also have a role to raise in consciousness raising to ensure, and I think that the 5 points I pulled from here are sort of steps that they'd suggested around how that the client and counselor can establish clear goals that the client wants and sort of start with, what do you need, which is something I often do with my clients. I say, why did you book this appointment? Like, what were you hoping for? What would you like your life to look like? Then noticing environmental factors. So again, maybe goals that you could achieve by getting together with your colleagues or getting together with other citizens to push for. Is there actions that in the environment, the social environment, that you could use that could help you get these goals? Not just things you could do, but if you got together a bunch of other people that they could help you do. Look at environmental goals that might impede it. What are the risks? Because risks, though we often have to be okay with a certain amount of uncertainty, it's also important that we be aware of the risks we're taking. I do, again, a lot of that with clients that are thinking about direct action, that are thinking about different types of collective action, that there is risks. Determine the magnitude that the client can use their own agency. Again, people can become very discouraged if they feel they have to carry the entire weight of the world on their shoulders. And often, a lot of my work with environmentalists is often figuring out what thing do they want to focus on? What things do they personally feel they have agency over? What things could they, with others, have? And what types of problems do they need to tackle with other people involved? And then developing multiple scenarios, if this, then this, right? And seeing what types of futures they could come out of this and which ones they want to pursue, as well as, plans in case things go wrong or go unexpectedly, I should say. Do you have anything you want to add to the theories, Brian? I know I flew through those kind of quickly.
No, I made a few notes that I can bring up in our conversation, but I think the one thing I heard in a lot of those theories is kind of being adaptable, having different options is kind of they were central in all three theories. So we'll talk a little bit more on that. But well, thanks for sharing the theories, Trevor. Just giving us a framework to work from.
Absolutely. And again, there are many theories out there. But I found these, and particularly the advocating workers within environment theory, to really give both a theoretical framework and some clear action steps. If you're looking at how to really walk that line of maintaining individual agency while also consciousness raising around collective action. Which brings us to why the latter. And Brian, I think that was something you had, I think, first brought up.
I think it was a question that came up as we were kind of brainstorming, kind of planning out this talk. And like, why the latter? I guess the initial conversation was when we're looking at helping clients do career change or resume building or whatever, that there's always that kind of look at, well, how do we move you up that one next little step in your career, right? Which career development talks about kind of growth. But I think as we look at those like the theories we talked about, so planned happenstance, hope centered, advocacy, that there's we talked about being adaptable and curious, and that. So I kind of threw it to you, Trevor, as kind of a kick you off. Like, how do you see those theories playing into that balance of, we've got, be curious, check out opportunities, personal growth, look at social causes, and like, you need to climb a ladder to get more money and benefits and stuff, like so.
Well, I think that this type of question really made me kind of self-reflect a lot on what I suspect many other sorry about this, career professionals do, which is that we often have an incentive to encourage and impose sometimes the growth within a career. That, we often talk about, you got to get a promotion, you got to become a manager. We, in our society, we pay often people in management roles more than we pay people in non-management roles. We pay people to kind of move up and specialize, whether or not they necessarily want to, right? And I think that really made me question some of my own practice around why we do that. Because we do know there are jobs that we do just pay a living wage and give people dignity and respect for just staying the job. A good example is some of the medical professionals, say X-ray technicians, MRI technicians, for example, that there's some formal training, but the job itself is the job. It's a well-paid job, and you do it. And if you want to, there's a little bit of room for movement, but that at the same time, that we don't devalue the person for just doing their job. And I think that really being critical, again, why the latter? Why are we demanding that people move up jobs? And I think that often what we call entry-level jobs or survival jobs are sometimes the starkest example of this. So like, I've worked in grocery stores, I've worked in call centers, I've worked in restaurants, fast food, and some of these jobs have almost a stigma to them, that if you stay in them, even though we recognize that somebody needs to work in the grocery store, somebody needs to work in the restaurant, or in the retail store, you're criticized for kind of and disrespected by sometimes the public and by your wages, right? That we don't reward people for doing a necessary job. And I think we talked a bit about that last time too, that, if we compare the waste disposal workers who take away our garbage and prevent us all from having a cholera epidemic, to medical doctors, even though there's definitely a different perception in how we perceive those two jobs, even though both are essential to a functioning society.
Oh, I think that makes sense, Trevor. I think I like the idea that reframing the conversation of like survival jobs or entry-level jobs. I remember once I had a client who was saying, like, I'm just looking for a survival job. I'm like, your survival job might be somebody else's dream job. And you are never going to beat them in an interview, because they're going to have the passion for this job. Is their ideal, right? Versus yours is you're thinking of it as a survival job. So I wonder, even in the how can we help people reframe their work to understand it's, it is decent work.
Mhm. I mean, that's really challenging, right? I think that what we're doing is there's the consciousness raising piece, just noticing, right? Noticing that we do perceive these jobs differently, and that there's very much even if it's not always expressly said, if you there is sort of an implicit status difference between some of these, and kind of really questioning it. I mean, I question it within myself, but sometimes I'll bring it up as a kind of topic to the client, that waste disposal versus medical doctor example is an easy sort of thought experiment to highlight it to people. But even with clients, like, you can work at a grocery store and be extremely good at your job. And it can be and it can be extreme, and just to recognize that it is sort of um, unfair that, people in some of these jobs aren't given a living wage, that they aren't treated with the same dignity, and that they lack the power. I think COVID particularly showed how we treat a lot of people who really make society function, and that really raised a lot of people's awareness that um, these are human beings, but they're not being treated as such.
And Trevor, just as a last question on this to kind of frame, but you talk about humanizing, right? And I think that as a career developer, we also need to look at how we're life developers as well. How do we create that, that balance between the work and play, the health and, time for your relationships and stuff. But beyond just the work, how do we, as career developers, support people in getting decent work that is both balancing their work life learning balance, right? That's all what we talk about. So
Well, and I think you're going back to your aspect on truth and reconciliation around not kind of really approaching each person as an individual human being. Again, my opening lines often to clients, I ask them about what are the most important relationships in your day-to-day life? What are the most important experiences in your day-to-day life? How do your family and friends perceive you, or what are your relationships with them? And then really trying to talk about, like, what do you feel you need for your life to feel good, to feel better about your life, and really trying to let them lead that. But then also recognizing that I can, as much as I can, really do self work to make sure I'm treating everybody with dignity, regardless of their station or their position. That it's also important that people out there do that as well. And that's, I think, sometimes some of the genesis for part of what we kind of came together for this workshop was not just making sure that we ourselves are doing the self-reflection work, but really, being advocates for that, and really encouraging clients that sometimes maybe you need to get together with other people if you want that dignity to be demanded from the larger society. And that can again look like, whether it's grassroots organizing, and people often think unions, but that can be a lot of different things around that. That can also be nonprofits. We see that in the environmental movement too, right? If you need something changed locally, you need to get together with a group of people, because there is a power in numbers, and a power that maybe you as an individual won't be able to achieve. And finding your community too. I think there's a lot of shared support out there. There's a lot of organizations out there and groups out there for different issues, and really trying to encourage and empower clients to find that community and work together within that. I know we talked a lot about labor resources last time, and resources and tools that they can use once they've done that, but really taking the time to get to know the client, taking the time to see the client, and then taking the time to empower the client to move forward and build their own community, and to see them, not just see themselves, but see themselves in community, that where they have dignity, they have strength, and they have the knowledge to really create a better world for themselves and others.
I guess one question to throw you at the end. We talked about learn, understand, act, reflect. I'm curious, just in the next minute or two, what was the reflection you're taking away from kind of these conversations we've had over the webinars and stuff, Trevor, and just preparing for them as well, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to bounce this question back at you in a moment too. But
I know.
I think that I did. I definitely learned a lot about kind of operationalizing a lot of these strategies. I think that often we talk about these things in theory, but when we really sit down and and using how do we use some of these teachings, truth and reconciliation points in a very tangible way? How can we use that to empower clients' lives? I think that that was really, really helpful. I think a lot of the discussions we had around really analyzing some of those points, we'll send out the slides so everyone will have access to it, of course, but really thinking about, okay, how do we operationalize these theories and these teachings and these understandings, this knowledge in a way that fundamentally improves not only the individual in front of our lives, but gives them the tools to go and improve society as a larger space. How about yourself, Brian?
I think it's been enjoyable just kind of, learning from each other and kind of sharing and learning, and even in these discussions, like talking about it. And I think taking the actions in the kind of couple of weeks between our chats and stuff of thinking through, like, how do I apply this in the work I'm doing? Like, how do I change some of the conversation with some of the students I'm supporting, looking for, current jobs, kind of help pay the bills while they're in school, or future careers and stuff like that. And how to help them kind of have those conversations of what is decent work to them, and how does that play out, right? And how does that how do we get to those jobs, or how do we have those conversations with people who'd be looking to hire, right? So I think it's just been good to kind of soak in and take the things. And like, I know I'm gonna go look up some of those theories that you shared today. Just want to go read a bit more. I'm not sure of the one, but I think it sounds a great thing. I think that's kind of where taking the reflective learning and not just the webinars. I know we're going to send out the slide decks and stuff. We've got a couple of resources that we highlighted as well at the end of the first recording, and then into this recording as well, that will highlight just some resources that are these are some of the resources I drew upon when I was creating our talk on kind of the truth and reconciliation. There's a great resource by Zurich there that we've shared, Truth Reconciliation by Jody Wilson-Raybould, and that's where I kind of built some of the Learn and Understand and Act from. It's a great book. I listened to the car over last, back in January, I guess is when I listened to that. And Inconvenient Indians, a great book. I just finished that one recently as well. It just kind of lays out the history of Indigenous people in Turtle Islands of both America and the US, and Canada. And then also the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, just kind of highlights some things. So these are just resources. There's also a Google Doc there of some of my rough notes as we were preparing the speech. So there's some more calls to action that I had made notes on that I just hadn't had time to talk on.
Absolutely. I love too that you share all of your work and your own thought process there too for people to access. This was sort of a quote that we had ended our last one with, or we included in our last presentation, I say. I don't really want to reiterate here. Again, this is a Indigenous advocate, I believe from Australia, who kind of said, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that we talk a lot about that this was sort of the other half of the climate struggle, that we want to empower individuals to navigate the climate crisis. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but at the end of it, I've come to the sort of conclusion that this is not a solitary problem. This is something that people need to work together on, and people need to find their power to create collective change. That they shouldn't and to ask really deep questions. I know that why the latter question, right? Why is it that, again, some individuals, based on what their skills, their interests, as well as the intersectionality of their own identity, their health limitations, their whether it's all these aspects, why is it that those things mean that some people have access to a more enjoyable or easier or more luxurious life than others? And really asking ourselves, why isn't every person, by virtue of being a human being in society, allowed to have existence that is dignified, respected, connected with others, and of course financially compensated, so that they can have the freedom to make choices that will benefit their life. Here's our contact information. Same as before. I don't think I've changed my email address or website. Have you, Brian?
No, I think it's the same.
Awesome. So we're going to really appreciate you coming to this two-part webinar. We're going to open it up to, again, question and answer. And thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, everybody, for your time. And if you have any questions that you don't have time to get kind of into the chat, just feel free to email me or Trevor, and we'll share the conversations and kind of hopefully keep the conversation going. But thank you for taking the time, and I hope you are able to kind of take something away from what we've shared with you.